Hi, this is David Pretorio with the Mitigating Unauthorized Scraping Alliance. Our webinar is going to begin in just a few moments. Thank you for joining. Thank you, everyone. My name is David Pretorio. I'm here with the Mitigating Unauthorized Scraping Alliance and Renata Spinks. And today we're going to talk about safeguarding national security, the impact of nation-state web scraping on warfighters' welfare. In today's digital age, data has become a strategic asset, and its protection is paramount for ensuring national security. However, the rise of nation-state scraping poses significant challenges to this security landscape. This webinar aims to delve into the far-reaching ramifications of nation-state web scraping on our nation security and the welfare of our warfighters. Join us as we explore the intricacies of this issue and discuss strategies for safeguarding sensitive information in an era of persistent cyber threats. By raising awareness, fostering collaboration, and implementing proactive cybersecurity measures, we can fortify our defenses against evolving cyber threats and uphold the integrity of our defense infrastructure. Thank you for joining us today on this crucial conversation to safeguard our collective security in an increasingly interconnected world. And now I'll turn to introducing Ms. Spinks. She is a senior cybersecurity and technology executive whose diverse experiences reaches across multiple sectors. She's an formerly active duty with the executive branches of the federal government, including intelligence community and Department of Defense. As a retired career officer who most recently served as the assistant director for IT and the deputy chief information security officer for IC4, the United States Marines. She also served as a senior information security officer. Leveraging her federal, industry, and military experiences, Ms. Spinks led the influential transformational efforts, not only within the services, but is known for establishing roadmaps and implementation techniques for information technology enterprise capabilities, as well as cybersecurity across multi-program internally and externally to the Department of Defense. She's currently the founder of CyberSec International, which is making its mark in industry as the go-to problem-solving company for approaches to doing business with the federal government, specialty cyber operations, intelligence-driven information technology, enterprise governance, transition, planning, and modernization. For her full bio, please feel free to visit her website at renataspinks.com. So with that, Renata, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I think it's going to be a rich conversation, very timely. But I think the most gratifying thing about it is to get a chance to kind of share probably a topic that isn't usually on the top of mind for everyone when we're thinking about the national cybersecurity strategy, artificial intelligence, machine learning. We're having conversations, but lots of zero trust is out there. There's so many competing priorities. So I'm excited to have this conversation today about not only just the data, but some of the things that's happening to our data out there.
That's right. I mean, I think it's so important to help people understand the threat landscape and what is going on and what professionals like yourself are seeing, both within the service and outside of the service. Can you talk through a few examples that you're aware of nations states web scraping incidents that are targeting our warfighters and military websites?
Well, absolutely. If we want to take it in a chronological order, a few years back, you and I talked a few times about the Fitbit and pre-positioning and locations of our military soldiers and using that information based on them basically doing what they're supposed to do, which is physical fitness. So making sure that they are monitoring their health and exercises and using technology to help do so. But then the adversary comes into play, and that information was extracted and utilized. And some people came to me and they said, well, I don't understand why it's such a big deal. It's just, healthcare data. And it's not really earth shattering. But when you aggregate that kind of data and you are utilizing it, not just the healthcare part, and the diagnostics and, how many heartbeats, is happening while the soldier or the Marine or the sailor is exercising. But there's also location, where are troops located in the world when they are executing those exercises. Um, Sometimes you have the app that's downloaded to the mobile phone, and those phones are communicating back home to, wives and children and teachers and, the whole gamut. So that got my attention back in 2018. Most recently, we've had a lot of leaks of classified data in, multiple forums. Well, even though it's a leak of information, meaning someone deliberately provided some information, so not so much scraping, but the scraping that we saw was how do we find people to target so they can provide us those kinds of informations. So, you look at the many social media pages that we use in an effort to, build industry partnerships and communicate in a great manner. So when you think about it on the front end, it's nothing wrong with us participating in the Twitters. It's nothing wrong with us sending messages on Facebook and the LinkedIn and sharing information. But there's two sides to the coin. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today as we talk about open source information and open source code. You think about sharing code and all the things we are doing to try to increase efficiency within our workspace and make things a whole lot maybe not easier, but probably practical, I like to say. It may not be easy, but we're trying to streamline and lean into making things better and better use of our time and taking advantage of a digital transformation that's not slowing down. You think about artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, large language models, all of these great tools that we use because I use them. I raise my hand. I do use Chat GPT, whether that's research or wordsmithing, or it's always great to get someone else's idea. And quite honestly, I used it because I was curious. I wanted to actually see, what's all the hype about and what are some of those challenges that we have to face from a security perspective. So I can't inform myself about that technology without using it and actually seeing how the technology works. So, so those are just two that I'll talk about that I'll mention just for the purpose of this question, because I know we're going to have a longer conversation.
That's right. And just to kind of bring everybody so we're all on the same page, the that I guess it was a Fitbit or a fitness tracking wristband that some of people in the services were using, and I think it was a program actually that was encouraged by the by the Department of Defense or some individuals
Hmm.
within the entity. And what was going on was these Fitbits, then people were updating or syncing the data from them to a social media platform that was specifically designed for people interested in fitness. And then
Yes.
that platform inadvertently broadcast the information about individuals and their locations. And so
Hmm.
what happened is somebody who could scrape that data and process it would be able to figure out, oh, okay, there might be a military base here, or this is a path that somebody takes every day to go from the base to perhaps a point of interest in a foreign
Hmm.
country. And so the risk there, which was not totally unanticipated, I guess the big issue was the people actually using the devices were thinking, hey, I'm doing this program, it's helping, it's healthy. They didn't really realize that there was this risk out there from people scraping or potentially scraping this information to learn more about where our troops are, where our bases are, what our troop movements are, what individuals, because you could actually track down to an individual person based on the
Hmm.
data that was available from scraping. So, I mean,
Yeah.
those are all the kind of things that you're talking about and that you've helped now that you're out of the service and you're working with individual companies to understand. Is that correct? There's a lot of education that's needed when people think about, well, what data am I making available, and then what access Or what are the bad actors doing to take that data, do something else with it that I never intended? Is that kind of what you're seeing out there?
Absolutely, absolutely. Being able to work with industry on what I like to say this side of the world, meaning no longer sitting in an active senior executive billet, but being able to farm those questions and also anticipate information that we may not know. You hear us as leaders say, "Well, I don't know what I don't know." So sometimes you don't really know what questions to ask. And so what's great about, coming out and building those partnerships and information sharing with industry is being able to educate and inform, as well as, get the feedback of what they're seeing because, there are targeted attacks on our government contractors because they are actually part of the ecosystem. We do business with them. So some of the threats that they are seeing is also valuable to have the conversation versus just saying, well, here's what we were seeing within the services, and here is how we were managing risk or mitigating risk, or in some cases, 100% just avoiding the risk because sometimes the risk was just too high. And so one thing that Cybersecurity International, my company, does is we work from an intelligence perspective and we provide instruments, research based, and we take it, we sit down with companies and we basically ease their mind just a little bit. We provide them with assessments. What is your data posture? What's your data loss prevention strategy? And sometimes it can be so intimidating, especially to some of the small companies that have all these different regulations that are coming out right now. And it's a bit intimidating. And so how do you kind of give them a straight line path? Maybe 120 controls don't really apply to one particular application, but maybe the critical controls, meaning, use zero trust architecture as your friend, layer your network, segment, make sure your identity and access management approach is as tight as it can be because nothing is ever 100% secure. But just starting with the endpoint user devices and the identity can mitigate a whole lot of risk when it comes to what the threat actor is looking for and how they're looking to penetrate. But also that stops them from being able to scrape the data. We talk to them about their public facing websites, and we make sure that we understand. I know you want to do a lot of business. I know you want to put a lot of capabilities on your public facing website because you want the information out there. But a great example, I was working with a company last week, and we just kind of go in 2 or 3 days. We don't take up a lot of their time having them offline, but they had their contract numbers, they had their standards and who they were doing business with. And it was great information for people who are trying to find companies that already have a vehicle available and things like that. But these were not publicly available activities. It wasn't the GWAC, it wasn't the GSA schedules. It was, we have a contract with these and here. And so we use that as an example to say, if I was a bad guy and I wanted to target you as a company, now I know who else to go and target.
Mhm.
Now I also know what contract numbers there are. So now I'm putting my acquisition team at risk. So maybe I'll go out on LinkedIn and find out, well, who's the acquisition for, this particular agency, because you have readily available given me information. Like, for example, I have a contract with Venable. Well, if I have that on my website, and there's a link to Venable, the company, because I want people to see who I'm doing business with. Now, David, you just became a target. Your colleagues have just became a target because I'm the bad guy and I want information. So I go scraping the internet, whether that's the dark web. I know we're going to have that conversation,
Yeah.
or the public facing information where information is just readily available. And the dark web would be a whole nother webinar, but there's so many resources that we use from just publicly available information. And yes, it's scary, yes, it's intimidating, but there are many ways that we can add to our cyber warfare approach by just kind of using a little bit more vanilla
Hmm.
information out there and not, I know we're going to talk about best practices later on. But some of those things that we can do as a citizen, as well as the things that we can do as companies, those are the things that CyberSec International prides ourselves in sitting down and actually mulling through, taking the time to explain some of the risks, staying within the boundaries of classified information, of course, but there's ways to communicate open source information and allowing people to understand the risks that are being taken, but also give them a solution.
Hmm.
We don't go in there and pick out all the problems without saying, here's how we're going to help. Here's how we're going to help you solve it. And sometimes it's just instead of that contract information, you can put, we are a government contractor. If you want more information, click here and force them to send an inquiry. And then you can have a one-on-one conversation. And that's how you can kind of control who's truly receiving accurate data. And that's just one example.
That's such a helpful example because I think everybody wants to kind of show off, oh, we just got this contract or put an announcement or a press release. And to your point, all that is scrapable. And whether
Mm-hmm.
or not your terms of service or terms of use says that you can or can't scrape, uh,
Mm-hmm.
people are going to come along and they're going to try to grab that data for competitive analysis. In the adversaries or other nation states, they may be trying to figure out, okay, are you trying to prepare for a large troop movement, or are you
Exactly.
trying to make a new kind of weapon or something like that and see
Mm-hmm.
parts for it? And I think that's a great example of how the interests or the concerns are different between if you're just opening a grocery store
Mm-hmm.
versus okay, you're actually opening a contractor that the military is using to provide goods and services, and
Right.
how those concerns are different. You mentioned one way is to kind of put up a web form to, don't put everything out there. Are
Mm-hmm.
there other things that you've seen or that you've given advice to small companies that are just getting into this space and kind of, to your point, overwhelmed with all of these concerns or may not be aware of scraping and maybe better ways they can show that they can add value to a third party or a military entity.
Well, I think the mitigation of unauthorized scraping, when you can, reach out to resources, reach out to people, when you're a small company, like I started my own company and, because of the structure of my company, it's a corporate structure. So I have to have a board of advisors. There's also a board of directors. And so the personnel that I target are people who are familiar with all of the challenges that a small business has. I don't just call my sister up and say, hey, want to start this company with me? I do that as a support mechanism, but not for her expertise. And so that's one way, there's a lot of open forums. Your website actually has best practices published. There's lots of white papers
That's right.
that you can go out there and educate yourself on. But past that, if you are educating yourself on your own, but it's still not your niche, it can still also be daunting. So you want to attend webinars like this. You want to go to the privacy conferences where the experts can easily be accessible and you can get that kind of information and invest in the education part, and also, just spend a little bit of money bringing some solution architects into your company and letting them walk you through a couple facilitated exercises on what we do, just assessing your presence. Another thing that you can do is spend a little bit more time just focusing on how you're going to protect your data. Actually come up with a data protection architecture, whether that's the tools you're going to use for data loss prevention, how are you going to secure your endpoints, how are you going to make sure your identity and access management is in place, how do you make sure you onboard personnel, and then how do you keep your personnel educated, right? When you're hiring employees, how do you make sure they have access to those resources, and many different things out there that are required compliance, especially in order for you to work with the federal government. Yes, sometimes you have to go and talk to those big companies who, they can afford to have all the resources in place and, work and do teaming agreements. There's mentor protege programs out there as well. So it all boils down to taking advantage of the many resources that the United States Small Business Offices provide to everyone, but also there's some inside things, housekeeping activities that you can kind of do right out there on the internet, and just kind of select some pretty reputable companies that you just kind of go to. There's certain companies I go to for certain information. I don't go to Google and just, anti-scraping. There are certain companies like yourself that I know is providing accurate information. They also have, a contact me page where you can contact, say, who else can I speak with to learn a little bit more. And it's just continual opportunity. The intestinal fortitude that it takes to always be a learning organization is so critical. No matter if you're a small company or a large company or a medium-sized company, I think you feel it more as a small company, though.
So I think, looking at the Musa practices document,
Mm-hmm,
so many of the things you just said kind of align one to one with what's it.
mm-hmm,
For example, we're talking about prevention. I'm looking here at page 7 of our practices guide. And a way to disincentivize unauthorized scraping is to remove or limit public access to information. That's exactly what we've just been talking about. And what
mm-hmm.
you guide your clients. Another thing that they mention is to rate limit endpoints. And so have you, what is your experience in that area, or kind of saying, well, what is that something you give, provide to your clients, or the guidance that you're giving out on the field?
Absolutely. So one of the things we did within the Marine Corps when we were dealing with not only just COVID-19, but just outdated technology, data centers are flooding, they're not performing at their peak. And so we talked, you hear the theme right now at the Department of Navy talking about infrastructure. So we focused on our infrastructure, right? We not only focused on test and evaluation of the capacity of our systems, but the load balancing was also important. The circuitry and the ability to connect was also important because we needed to move to the cloud in a very quick manner. The conversation evolved very quickly when you're saturating your bandwidth and you're saturating your network, and you're utilizing a large scale of bandwidth. But so many times we skip over, I won't say forget, but we skip over something as simple as I'm experiencing latency on the network. And the first thing we think about is the network layer. By default, I get it.
Mhm.
It was a discipline that I had to actually take a step back, as we were trying to solve some very grave problems. But we looked at it, and we could never figure out if we have a network problem and we are mitigating those challenges that we are experiencing, why is the network still experiencing latency? Lo and behold, the physical layer was what we skipped. We didn't look at the endpoint devices. We didn't look at our laptops. We did not initially say, hey, we need to look at three things in parallel. We want to be agile, but we didn't do that initially. Now, you'll go Google me and you'll hear me talk many times about how we had a roadmap to the cloud. But I'm honestly saying, even though we saw endpoint security and endpoint devices on the roadmap, it wasn't there initially. It wasn't one of the first things that we looked at. We initially went to the network and the transport. How do we get to the cloud, right? And so when you think about endpoints, it's so necessary because usually if the adversaries tools, technique, and procedures, usually they are trying to attack at the application layer.
Mhm.
Sometimes at the network layer. Most times they definitely are trying to get the keys to the kingdom. They want to guess your password from a system administration perspective. But we are also seeing that they are now attacking our supply chain. And you have Intel over there. Pat Gelsinger is really looking at you know how we modernize our chips, and then our semiconductor space. So all of that physical is now on the table even more. And so when you think about one of the best practices, the endpoints, I think you're spot on. I think your entire document of best practices, yes, it's a lot. And what do you focus on? Unfortunately, you're asking me, I think you focus on all four,
Mhm.
but you
Yeah.
take your time to come up with a strategic approach so that you aren't overwhelmed. You close one door, which is your endpoints, Then we can work on another team in parallel can be working on the software, and then another team can be working on identity. And now you have in parallel an agile approach because we're trying to keep up with the pace, if not exceed the pace of an adversary. And so I like to say instead of thinking about, oh, we're in competition, no, let's have the conversation that we're already in conflict. Things move pretty quickly when you're in conflict. And so if we take that approach, we take documents like the best practices and we create these in parallel lines of execution.
So one of the other things, the practices document, the Musa practice document talks about is detection and mitigation. I'm looking at it on page 8 right here on my screen. And it talks about, monitor and identifying unauthorized data scraping. And two things we kind of cover are monitoring traffic, which I believe you just touched on, and
Mm-hmm.
then identify indicators. And I think that's a great example you just gave where like you weren't necessarily looking at the endpoints. You were kind of looking somewhere else, but it took time to uh, put together the indicators that work for your organization. And
Mm-hmm.
can you talk about perhaps the importance of traffic monitoring, something very basic that everybody talks about, but in the context of scraping, and then maybe also these indicators and how an organization can develop their own set of indicators, or how advise your clients on things that they should be looking at, because the threats are different for each organization, and the attacks are slightly different too. So the indicators logically would be different as well.
Absolutely. So you have Big DISA and you have the Big DODIN, Department of Defense Information Network, and they are under attack. I want to say into the millions on a daily basis. You
Wow.
think about the Secret Service, same thing, the White House, White House Communications, all these large scale organizations, Department of Commerce, I mean, the entire federal government. So you scale that down when you think about small, medium, into large companies, whether they're government contractors or commercial and industry um, businesses. The reason I like to pause just now and include the industry is because when you're when we are, even though we're having a conversation about warfighters, you use an example of the target breach or the challenges that we see from a credit card perspective and the attacks on the financial spaces. Maybe not war fighting as we know it, you meaning inside the building with troops on the ground.
Mhm.
But if the soldiers are deployed or just in their day-to-day operations in the current homeland and their wife's debit card is breached, it still affects the warfighter because that phone call is going to happen. Unplanned funding is going out of an account, and now there's an infringement of your economic stability. And so think about that on a large scale, right? Think about that happening to, tons of people, whether they're soldiers or not. So I like to include industry because we're all in the United States, we're all citizens, and we're all taking advantage of the great privileges that our active duty military service is defending. However, semicolon space, when we think about some of the scraping that's occurring and the challenges that we are seeing, log data, although it's like you said, everyone is talking about the same things, but we have to get good at doing the basics.
Yep.
That comes from discipline because sometimes I like to use the word complacency. Sometimes there's a little bit of complacency. I don't like to use it. I lie. My son introduced me to that word one day. It sounded like you got some complacency going on, mom. And I like that word when he called it to my attention. And I just kind of adopted it as I think that's what happens sometimes on the network where we get so comfortable
Mhm.
with business as usual and we start to get a little too comfortable, and sometimes that's where we slip up from simple things, not changing your password or making it a difficult to guess password, or if we're thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is one of the attack mechanisms that is occurring, making it complex enough so that the machines aren't able to learn what your password is, because there are many different models out there that are being trained to use artificial intelligence to attack us, right? So log data is so important. Critical to log data is that human being who cannot sift through all of the data. We just can't. It's humanly impossible. So how do we figure out what the critical metrics need to be so that our data scientists can program these algorithms and we can take advantage of the goodness of digital modernization and the goodness of machine learning and picking up those patterns, because your intelligence is only as good as the data that you're feeding it.
Mhm.
Even when you get to large language models, even when you get to generative AI, it's still all about the data. And if it's garbage in, it's going to be garbage out. And that's just the
That's
truth
right.
about it, right? We do have some deep learning and some other levels of sophistication, but again, it all goes back to the data. So understanding log data, um, the intrusion detection systems, that log data is so important because even though it is not detecting an infiltration, it is picking up on the attempts. And so that's why we can have a conversation of, thousands and thousands of attempts. And then we can also see what was targeted. Was it a system that was targeted? Was it an application that was targeted? Another conversation is insider threat and the ability to monitor the behaviors of our employees who rightfully have access to our information environment. But log data is your friend, and if we don't pay attention to what the technology is there for and the information that it's telling us, then no matter how many best practices we have in place, we're going to miss the opportunity to be a little bit more vigilant on our networks and quite possibly stop the next major intrusion or the next utilization of data through data scraping, so that people can take that information and use it on the other side of on the enemy line. And, we're sitting there saying, how did they know, right? I think back to, I was watching Pearl Harbor the other day. I was watching that movie, and a great testament of history, the way the Japanese snuck up on us, but the way we responded. Could you imagine how much data scraping would have been going on back then with the way troops were needing to be moved and how fast we were trying to respond, the intel that we had, and even when the president on the movie said, our boys are flying blind. And so think about that. Being able to know how the I almost said the Marine Corps, but how the Army or the Navy or whomever is positioning gives you a leg up
Yeah.
because we can then be proactive. We kind of call that intel gathering, whether that's mission planning or operations. Um, it's definitely a benefit to have that data. So the scraping is so important. And after watching Pearl Harbor, it kind of just brought to mind the next big thing that's getting ready to happen this year, which is the election.
That's
And
right.
how whether it's Fitbit data, whether it's pre-positioning data, whether it's the location of voters and the percentage of people who are registered, what is their pattern of voting. I mean, all of that, if it were me, as we're thinking through some of the things that we need to be ready for, all of that is important because anyone who's trying to destabilize our democracy by attacking the vectors of securing our election, then that's what they're going to target. They need the information so they know what places are more vulnerable versus those that are not. Um, and so again, the logs are so important. But think about this, David. What about those rural areas that they don't have all that technology in
Mhm.
place, but they still have a highly visible population for voting? Um, how do you address the data scraping that's going to happen there? And I think the Census Bureau is probably the next place that we should be thinking through. So, for the sake of me and aggregation of data, because I do believe the aggregation of data is a powerful tool, I'll leave it there and not give too many specifics about what I think the bad guy may be doing.
Mhm.
I'll leave that up to our Cyber National Mission Force up there at Cyber Command and CISA. I think Jen Easterly has got her hands full, but Homeland Security, I have a lot of trust and admiration in those leaders. But that's another space of data scraping that I think you all will be real busy pushing out some more white papers on, what it looks like when we're thinking about election security and all of the data points that could be a target.
Yeah, that's so right. We're here in the US, we're going in, just so people watching us overseas, we're going into our election season with presidential elections, congressional elections, Senate elections coming this fall. And so there are a lot, to Renata's point, there is a lot of information available online about who the election officials are, voting information, who voters are, perhaps, and being able to scrape that information and put it together. You could build a profile about voters, locations, et cetera, that could be used, in probably a lot of different ways. And to your point, when you look through, especially the registered versus unregistered voters, past voting history, a lot of that stuff is just out there and it's available online. And again, a website may say, "Hey, you can't scrape us," but a lot of this bad actors that are scraping, they don't care.
Right.
And I'm sure you've seen that before. And I mean, are there any of your clients that are small municipalities or trying to figure out, like, is it a good idea to post that amount of information, or and strike that balance between, hey, we want people to vote, but we don't want our voters to get taken advantage of. Is there any kind of insights you have from, your experience working with clients in that area?
Yes. For the past 2 months, I've had a client or a group of clients because they're part of this alliance, and some of the nonprofits that we're also working with to help some of the state and local teams is what I will call them, because some of them are cities, some of it is just state and local towns because they have their mayors and different things like that. I'm from Louisiana, so we have parishes there. So it's here, it's counties, but no matter the size or what the geographical description is, what we are seeing is the vanilla, the dilution of data, making sure that, instead of providing specific data, let's give some aggregate data, meaning 17% of the population hasn't registered. Okay, that's great information. But being able to drill down is where the challenges are coming. And so what we're starting to see is people keeping the data at a high level and starting to have information a little bit more close hold. We are also talking about internal protections and how do we stop the data loss challenges as well as insider threat, because we don't want anyone leaking the information that we're trying to keep off the internet as well. And what are those predictive behaviors that indicate that we have an insider threat problem? That's been a large challenge of trying to identify that while keeping the privacy and the civil liberties of our employees at the forefront of our thought process, because you can be pretty intrusive when you're trying to predict behavior and say, well, it indicated that you may be an insider threat. That's a fine piece of thread on the needle. So I'm very 100% aware of that. And so in some cases, you have to accept a little bit more risk when it comes to the civil liberties and the privacy of your citizens and constituents. But from a systems perspective, from a technology perspective, there's ways that you can require registrations and access to information. Like you have to justify why you need that information.
Yeah.
The SEC does it very well. The SEC, there's publicly available data for data scientists to use for their research and things like that. But there's a full justification. The raw data is I don't like to call it dummy data, but it's data that they've already classified at a certain level, and have, I guess you could say, reduced the risk of the information being aggregated to a certain point where it is damaging. And so that's what we are working with. This particular coalition is working with. This is 2 states that we have a contract with, and that's what we're advising. Is it necessary to have people's names and their addresses on this particular website? And oh, by the way, does it need to be on your SharePoint page internally? And if it is, then we need to show you the many different tools that are available to segregate that data and make sure it's segmented and that only people who have a need to know have access to the data. And when when you're having conversations with the public sector and you say need to know, the first thing they kind of say is, well, we don't require clearances, and this isn't the government. So I've been trying to figure out a few more words to come up with to not kind of scare them off. But look, we're not trying to get people security clearances, but we are trying to make sure that those who need access to certain data sets have that access, but also being able to make sure that those who don't need access, and we do a better job in our identity and credential access management. So that's where the biggest piece of the effort is when we're dealing with how information is out there. Um, and then just introducing different tools that can also help them identify anomalies and weird activities that's happening either internally to their systems or to their public facing websites. So that's two areas of focus that if we just get that 80% right, we can reduce a lot of the challenges and a lot of the propensity or the probability of infiltration occurring or the scraping to be beneficial. We can reduce those risks by a lot. But CyberSec is only one company. There's plenty of them out there that are also um, executing these, also kind of the mission thread that I described. So the work is plentiful because we definitely have an adversary that does not stop.
That's very true. I mean, thinking about this, it seems like the group of local municipalities you're working with on protecting our elections and thinking about scraping, they're very forward thinking. How many
Mhm.
how many municipalities though, like across the country, you're working with one group, but how many different ones kind of need to know more about scraping in your opinion, and maybe could benefit from this type of education just because the elections are so crucial here in the United States, kind of determines policy and so many other things. But the thought of, people scraping and then trying to take advantage, or, I think something we see in the private sector is people scraping to set up clone sites. And
Mhm.
clone sites that can look similar to a real site that contains, based on scraping, a lot of the features and imagery that is similar to the actual site, but might provide bad election information, bad location information of where to vote. How many, I mean, it seems like you're working with a pretty sizable group, but is this the norm, or is the group you're working with kind of forward thinking and there's a real deficit that a lot of other municipalities and state governments and federal agencies need to come up to speed on when it comes to scraping and the risks around that for our elections?
Um, I think the most truthful and transparent answer that I can give you is post the most post the past election, I think was the very first time that there have been some deliberate approaches to election security. And I think before then, everyone was always putting a good foot forward. But until you actually experience something so earth-shattering and until you actually experience, it's very difficult sometimes to actually put mechanisms in place to avoid certain challenges, and especially election security. So I think these are consortiums that exist. For me, I searched for them when I put in Google of election security. These consortiums just didn't automatically pop up. I actually had to go and dig for nonprofits out there that are helping state and local governments on readiness. I like to call it getting, what are you doing from a readiness perspective, but also how are you informing some of the small companies that are within the space. So I don't think the information is as prevalent as some of the other areas of focus that we hear about a lot. Um, some people say where you sit is where you stand. So because I work in security, it's on the top of my mind. But my sister is a teacher at Job Corps, and she's a guidance counselor. She works with all their programs. She's not picking up the phone every day calling me about their front-facing website.
Yeah.
She is not. And so it's incumbent upon us who work in these fields to bring attention to how we can help and how we can educate. It's kind of sort of like, when you go to your doctor, when you leave, they give you a nice little pamphlet of all the things you need to be aware of. So that's what we have to do with cybersecurity. I think you'll start to see, matter of fact, you already will see if you go to the CISA website or you list if you're plugged in to everything that the security agency is doing as we're prepping for election security. Lots of testimony happening. So you're communicating, what we're seeing and what are we doing to combat and work on that readiness. So the information is out there. I think what I've been advising the CEOs on is when you're standing up a company or even when you're running a company, oftentimes, it's not at the forefront of, your security to talk about data loss prevention and scraping. And so I hope that as we've evolved to, information security, sec DevOps, at one point, no one was really talking about embedding your security professionals with the application developers. Now it's by default, it's a conversation. So I hope that scraping will start to become one of those topics that we think about by default and that we surround ourselves with plans that include how do we make sure that the intelligence that's happening, that we actually have a program around making sure that we can take the information that we are receiving and put it to great use as part of our cybersecurity posture and strategies.
That's so helpful. Now, kind of taking this full circle in our last few minutes here, thinking about our warfighters and like there's two levels of guidance. Hopefully, we can give them in this webinar. One is if they're deployed or how can they protect their own information from being scraped or things that you give guidance on when you were in the service as a CIO to the
Mhm.
people that you worked with. And then second is for the people that are in charge of making sure our war fighters are safe. What guidance of generals, majors, all the way down the line, sergeants, what guidance would you give them in thinking about scraping and warfighter safety?
So that's a great question. One thing I loved about the Marine Corps, I had never seen this before from a command perspective, but the commandant at that time, it was General Berger, and prior to that was General Neller, and the deputy commandant of information, which is the arm of the communications teams within the Pentagon. We all came up with what we called a campaign, an information campaign, right? And we started informing each other about, hey, Marine, this is what's happening when you're pulling out your cell phone and you're communicating here, 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 and here. So we gave them different ways to make sure that their data is controlled. Just because Facebook has a requirement for your name and date of birth, they don't have a requirement to know where you went to high school at, how many jobs you've had in the past. Like there's so much that's not required. So just give the basics. We also would advise them of what we called old phone numbers. You don't want anyone calling you anyway, so don't give out your real phone number because those are the challenges of spam calls and all other kinds of things that can occur. So we just kind of gave them advice on how to better manage your information as best as you can. Another thing we talked about, which was probably a first, is helping people understand those end user license agreements when we're just scrolling through trying to get access to something and I agree, I agree, I agree. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You may have to click agree in order to get access to that information. But every end user license agreement or every rule of behavior that you agree to or every access agreement that you use, if you get to the bottom under arbitration or the legal terms of what happens if there's a bad thing, there's always something that says, hey, if you don't want us to share your data, you can opt out. Most times we don't take the time to peruse ourselves and sanitize our own data and the reason why I bring this up is because I am notorious for going to hotels and getting on their Wi-Fi. And before I leave them with a nice little letter that says, here's my little document. I am telling you that here's what I logged on to. Here's the name of my computer. And I need you to make sure that all my information is no longer on your network. And I need you to send me a certificate that says you have degaused my information. That's
Hmm.
what I do. because sometimes I need the Wi-Fi. Now, I try to do my own hotspot most of the time, but sometimes I use the Wi-Fi. So that kind of information is what we are teaching our Marines. That's happening. You're starting to see the Navy, the Army, all of the services within the Department of Defense, the CIO, as we have evolved to chief data officers and having people coming in with the expertise of data. So not only is the utilization of data and user experience, but also the security of such. So that's how we are addressing it from a warfighter's perspective. Aside from educating the general officers of all the things that can happen with how we use data and how we are information sharing, it's actually a default conversation. It happens more often than you think. Those conversations about compliance, not just a checklist, not just, oh, did you check the box and did you do this? But there's a continuum of being compliant and making sure you have a continuous currency of security within the applications and information, identity, access, controls, and management. Lots of companies out there are coming up with ways to help us do that by automating identity, right? And there are a few companies out there that are doing a great job of it that the government is taking advantage of to continue to not only protect our warfighters, but the warfighters, their friends, the companies that we work with. And after a while, what we hope to see is that there's not a divide on how we secure each other's data. It's something that it just happens by default, and we're all speaking the same language and we're going in the same direction, whether the tools are different or not. So that's pretty much how we increased our posture, informing and educating, as well as providing the tooling that's needed. Trying to turn a big ship of culture where we've held on to our own data. We've made sure that we had our own data centers. And I mean, that is commendable, but the technology is outpacing that type of culture. So it's great that we can see from the White House on down to many of the agencies, as well as how we partner with industry, that we're watching each other put together solutions that are evolving as we look at where we were to where we are and then where we're going. Like you said earlier, lots of leaning forward. And I'm gonna continue on this side of the space to call attention to, things like scraping and things like logging and things like metrics, and creating ways to identify how we are posturing ourselves to defend against the currency that's like oil, which is data. I mean, everyone knows I say it's all about the data. So not only is it all about the data, but the enemy gets to vote as well. And so there's a distinct balance that we have to strike when it comes to how much data we want to share. And we have to share the data. I mean, we are a democracy, so we can't hoard and we can't be so restrictive. But I think we have some great leaders in place that are helping with those creative minds on both sides of the field, whether that's or on both sides of our cybersecurity landscape, whether it's industry or internal to the good old Pentagon and all of the different locations where we have our warfighters, whether that's active duty in uniform, our government contractors, our civilian personnel, the consortiums that we partner with. It's all what I call a concerted and combined effort.
And on that point, just to kind of maybe one final point, and I think your experience you'd be able to provide some insights on this. A lot of companies are struggling and saying, look, if I lock down my site so tightly to defeat all the scrapers, they're going to
Mhm.
be the site or the platforms become unusable for end users. And I think in the military, you probably have the same concern where you need to allow some communications with family members. You need to provide some, ability for people to say, "Hey, I'm traveling" or something like that. But at the same time, protect, keep in mind the national security. And as a CIO, how did you balance those needs? Because a lot of the companies that I talk to and that are members of MUSA, they're really struggling with that too, because if you lock down a website so tightly or a platform so tightly and defeat all scraping, suddenly it
Mhm.
becomes almost unusable. And it's the same thing where, well, how do you don't want your warfighter to become totally isolated from their family, their friends, and their colleagues. So how did you strike that balance? And maybe that might provide some insights to some of our companies and people watching this today.
Yeah, so that's a great question. You heard me talk about critical path. And the reason I describe it as critical path is because we can't do everything. You can't secure everything. It's kind of like your house. You can't just sit in the house all day and all night defending your home. You leave eventually, and you either have an alarm system, you lock your doors, like you put some practices in place, and maybe you'll get broken into one day, quite possibly. But things like your alarm system and the sensing of a window being shattered because someone may be breaking in, and then the ability to call the police if there's no response, when that kind of very simple way of everyday living is the same way that I thought about it as the deputy CIO of the Marine Corps. We put those mechanisms in place. We lean on industry and partnerships with them. What is the best intrusion detection system? What is our prevention mechanism, and how should we be solutioning that? Our configuration database management control posture, not having a whole bunch of complacency, doing the basics, just foundational cybersecurity, and doing the best as we can to not have that level of complacency, making passwords difficult, focusing on the identity, credential, and access management, not just grouping everyone in one security group, but actually what does David need access to, and being able to manage that, as well as on the other side, creating those metrics and having logs being reported and dashboarding and taking advantage of the technology that's part of the licenses we're purchasing, and hoping that when we're looking at licenses and everybody kind of jumps to one feature that they like, well, there are some other features that are usually included. You're moving to the cloud. How do you defend in the cloud? That's someone else's house, right?
Mhm.
And so just we put a deliberate focus on, well, we're gonna have a great user experience, but we're gonna lead with security first. And so that's how we companies, no matter what side of the coin you look at, if you lead with security in mind, security by design, we partner with industry to do so, and we take that information as best we can, and there's a trust factor there. And we design these systems with the ability to share and the user experience as well as the security. That we struck a pretty good balance. But it wasn't because the Marine Corps or the Department of Defense was doing something special. It was a combined effort, whether that was working with industry and their engineers to help us better understand the power of the technologies that we were adopting, as well as training our users. So yeah, so you can't lock it down. Like I said, it's just like your house. You can't put a cement all on the windows. You can't see outside. You don't get a chance to enjoy the beauty of your yard, or if you're in the city, the beauty of what you like to look at in the city, and hearing all the sirens and stuff. I like both the city and the country. So whichever, but the point is, you can't just lock everything down. And so there is a deliberate approach. And then after you do as best as you can with that critical path of identity and credential and access management, data loss prevention, intrusion detection systems, defending in the cloud, and metrics, that critical path, you've closed up a lot of seams if you master those four, and train your people so that we can keep up with the emerging technology. But even more important is education. Understand what's happening. Understand what is the bad guy doing. What are those TTPs that we should be paying attention to, and invest in the right experts, because you're not, one thing that I loved was I had experts around me, and I was not a leader that was going to come and say, yes, General, I know everything. I'm going to give you all the answers. Absolutely not. I'm going to have my experts around. They have their certain niche. The lawyers are always in the room. We're always talking to the lawyers because they understand privacy. They understand the laws that could be being not adhered to. And so you're right. It is a delicate balance, but it's not something that's not impossible. My mom likes to say, it's called work, Renata. That's what it's called. It's not easy, but we put some deliberate elbow grease to it, and we keep going back and getting better. Every 90 days, you reflect and you get better. You lesson learn and you get better. It's not a just, okay, we've designed that one system and we're one and done. It is a continuum of expertise. It is a continuum of getting ahead of the bad guy, basically beating them to the punch, and then being ready for when your system is infiltrated. So having that mindset that they're going to get in if they're not already in. And so zero trust is very important. That architecture is critical for systems and small businesses. There's a spot for zero trust as well. Segmenting your network and understanding conditional access and making sure you have conditional access in place. I can go on and on throughout that architecture. But that critical path of those four tenets is what I concentrated on to keep us foundationally secure. And then you evolve from there.
Well, thank you so much. I think it was the fastest hour that I've done for this webinar series, and so much great information. And we touched on so many important things for our national security and ways to safeguard our national security, and thinking about scraping and the impact on elections and warfighters, and ways to kind of help people to navigate these difficult issues. So, I want to thank you so much. How can people find you online if they want to continue the conversation?
They want to continue the conversation. My website is www.renataspinks.com. I also have CyberSec International. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I do have a public profile. Yeah, and that is where I'll post my next engagements, some of the conferences that I think are valuable to attend. Yes, we keep a high profile on social media. But yes, I also make sure that the aggregation of data is not as easy, but lots of information out there. Also, you can find me at your local recruiter station if you're interested in ever becoming an active duty Marine, Army, Navy. Always an opportunity to have that conversation as well.
That's outstanding. Well, thank you so much. And thanks again. I'm David Patario with the Mitigating Unauthorized Scraping Alliance, and hopefully you'll join us again for our next webinar coming up in about a week. Thank you so much. Thank you, Renata.
Thank you.